パナソニックのリンです。皆様、こんにちは。いよいよコードブルー2020オンラインが始まりました。トップスポンサーとしてもとても楽しみにしています。さて、その始まりを飾る大切なキーノート、ミズ・オードリー・ギンチャーさんをご紹介させてください。ミズ・オードリー・ギンチャーさんは、イギリスのエッセックス大学の法学部の上級講師で、サイバー犯罪、特に新たなテクノロジーが刑法にどのような影響を与えるかを研究している方と伺っています。テクノロジーが進化していく中、自由で公正な社会を支える法律も同様に進化させる必要がありますよね。そんな議論から始まる今年のコードブルー、いよいよ始まります。期待して聞いてください。では、ミス・オードリー・ギンチャーさん、お願いします。
Good afternoon. I'm Audrey Guinchard, Senior Lecturer at the University of Essex and the United Kingdom, England. I'm here for this conference, Code Blue, so thank you, Code Blue, for allowing me to do this presentation, and especially as a keynote speaker. By the time you'll see this video, it will be 3 o'clock in the morning for me, and start pre-recording. Now, my presentation is on rethinking, and I'm going to show my screen, rethinking cybercrime legislation to support vulnerability research, so security research. And my starting point is the UK, but I'd like also to bring 2 international legal instruments. So my focus is really the legal point of view. It's not centered on computer science. My own background is that of a law academic, specialized in criminal law. I also do now data protection. And I also do 3 jurisdictions. I'm familiar with the UK and France, a bit less the US, but still. Now, this research is legal, but it doesn't ignore computer science. On the contrary, I have incorporated computer science research on vulnerability research and markets. I had conversations with the security industry, especially in the UK, where the part of that industry is pushing for reform alongside the network called the Criminal Law Reform Network that has looked at the Computer Misuse Act and has released a report freely accessible. The details are at the end of this presentation. So on the legal side, the aspect of the law that is to bear in mind is that it is jurisdictional, it's geographically based. But in cybercrime, it's not because you're in one country that you are protected from the other country, your neighbors, or countries that are a couple of thousand miles away from those countries claiming jurisdiction and claiming that they can bring you to justice. So really, my point was being in one jurisdiction doesn't protect as such. Now, that said, I'm going to look really at the UK and international legal instruments. There's 2 international legal instruments that I want to look at are the directive by the European Union, which the UK is getting out. I hope you didn't have as many news information on Brexit than we have here. You've been spared that. But you also have the Convention on Cybercrime number 185 by the Council of Europe. The way to distinguish the European Union from the Council of Europe is simply to think about it as a map. As you can see here, European Union will have 27 member states by 31st of December. Council of Europe will keep the UK and has currently 48 countries. My assumption is this work. I consider that, and I don't think that's a revelation really, that the vulnerabilities exist. They need to be found, they need to be patched. That is an essential contribution to the fight against cybercrime. So we need security researchers. The work is not necessarily approved by vendors and system owners. People are not necessarily employed by a contract. The work is usually in good faith. It's often spanned across different jurisdictions. It's linked with vulnerability markets that are perfectly legitimate. And it also involves academic researchers who do vulnerability research. So what is the key argument here? My key argument is that in an effort to catch cyber criminals, crime legislation have tended to be very broad and effectively too broad. And being so broad, what they did is that they created, at best, grey areas and therefore legal uncertainty about whether security research is legitimate or not, depending on the conduct, the behaviors. And at worst, they simply criminalize something that may be completely ethically correct and following ethical requirements, but in law it would not be. And now I'm here talking about the 3 stages of vulnerability research: discovery, proof of concept, I'm not talking about exploits, and disclosure. It's not a theoretical problem. You have multiple reports over the years on investigation, prosecution, and at time convictions. Convictions may be rare, but they exist. And more importantly, you don't really want to go through prosecution, having to pay a huge amount of lawyers' fees to get out of the hook. It's a problem in many countries: Japan, US, France, UK, Australia, Latin America. It's such a problem that the Electronic Frontier Foundation created the Codus Right project to protect security researchers in 2018. Internet Freedom Foundation also mentioned it in 2020, a couple of months ago. The European Cyber Security Agency and NISA also had published 2 reports on the problem. So what are the key elements that I'm going to go through in this presentation? The problematic points are access, authorization, intent, and tools. There are certain protective measures that can be taken, but not all of them will be enough. Actually, most of them are not going to be enough unless we go for public interest defense. And that is the key argument that I'm looking at. The key solution: how can we incorporate a public interest defense? And my conclusion. So the type of cybercrime offences, you have roughly 3, whichever legal instrument you look at: the UK, the directive, and the convention, and other countries. Unauthorized access, usually nickname hacking, but it is this. You have unauthorized damage and interference, misuse of tool as the 3 key offences. The summary of those offences are here, so you can have a look later on this. And I would like to go through key points. Authorization, what is it? Access, intent, and tools. In the knowledge that you have no immunity from prosecution. If there is no prosecution, it's simply because the prosecutor has refused to do so. So, key point of access. Now, in the UK, it's a complete misnomer. The offence exists even if you never ever obtain access. Okay, so there's no need of a result, which is access, it's just need of a conduct. And that conduct is defined very, very broadly. Causes a computer to perform any function with intent to secure access or to enable somebody else to secure access. So your colleague at work could be part of that. Now, access is defined in the Computer Misuse Act, CMA's Computer Misuse Act, Section 17. It's altering or erasing program or data, copying, using it, printing, because it was 1990, so we still have printers. But effectively, it's any conduct. And you can see it, plus you have attempt. So you can see it as that effectively anything in the UK, any conduct, any behavior is a crime if you fit the other elements, except the fault. Fault has not yet been criminalized, but switching on a computer is considered as fitting the definition of access. Clicking on a link has definitely been confirmed as being unauthorized access in the Ellis case. Same thing as pre-logging access on somebody who didn't log out. even though it was in that case to look at the legitimate newspaper website available free of charge anyway. Port scanning, depending on what you do, it can be it's certainly a grey area, and at worst it can become a danger zone that you definitely want to avoid. You have connecting a website to observe traffic, directory traversal test can be a crime. That was the case in 2005 in the UK. A lot of probing can be a crime. Unauthorized access, looking at analyzing compromised systems can be unauthorized access. So effectively, to summarize this, I put it in this form. In yellow at the bottom here, you can see the Computer Misuse Act of the UK. So roughly anything after the 4th is criminalized. You can see that the convention and the directive comes in much later when you are far closer to having obtained access. Another way of putting exactly the same information is to look at a pyramid. You can see the UK is at the bottom too. So very much a broad offense, much more restricted in other countries and definitely in the convention and the directive. Now, the UK is definitely an outlier, but is the UK the only country problematic? No, most EU and non-EU states have criminalized attempts, which means that you definitely don't need to reach the level of access to have gained access to have committing a conduct that can be criminalized. The additional element is that nobody defines the attempt in the same way, in addition to the fact that nobody defines unauthorized access in the same way. So you've got a huge legal uncertainty because what may be legal in one country will not be in the next one or in another one. Legal uncertainty is definitely for scanning ports. In some countries, it's considered as a preparatory act where you won't have liability. It can be an attempt, it will be liable, or full access. Same thing for connecting a company website, just to observe the others trying to gain access. Just that is preparatory with no liability in France, attempt in Netherlands, and definitely the complete offense in the UK. So that's for access. Now I'd like to move to authorization. Authorization is defined as somebody who, so lack of authorization is defined as somebody who has not himself a responsibility for access and authorizing that access, or we didn't have the consent of the person or company. So effectively, anybody who is not officially employed and contracted by a company and is looking at that network or website will have no consent, no authority. And even if you're contracted and employed, you may still fall of the law and fit that definition of lack of authorization. Now, in the directive, you have that definition. It's called without right. Same wording in the convention. It's called without right. And it is definitely, they are thinking about, the directive thought about security research, but they only mention it when they are contracted by vendors. So effectively, it's pointless because the main problem exists when the security researcher is not mandated by the system owner to look at the system or the network. The convention didn't really think I would think of independent researchers because they were not really the norm. Vulnerability markets appeared in 2005, 5-6 years after the convention was drafted. Now you'll think, well, I don't see where's the problem for authorization. I've got a vulnerability disclosure policy. It's a bug bounty programs. Everything is official. It's on websites, vulnerability markets. Well, the main issue is that policies are vague. Even the good drafted one can be vague. Vendors can refuse authorization afterwards. So a vulnerability disclosure policy may not protect you enough from vendors saying, I know that's not in my policy and I don't consider this as authorized. And you may find that is very difficult to argue the opposite. And that was found in the case of Mangum, even though Mangum was had problematic behavior. You also have, and that's called liability dumping by ENISA in its reports. And the last point that often security researchers says, well, I don't have intent to obtain access. I just want to fix vulnerabilities. I'm not there to create mayhem. But the law doesn't care about whether a person wants to save the world or cause Armageddon. Intent is just aim and purpose to obtain access, and the knowledge is not authorized. If you fit the fact of having access, not authorized, and your aim and purpose to do so, whether you do it for good reason or bad reason, it doesn't matter. The intent is not motives. And you have a case in the UK that definitely looked at this, Kuberth case 2005, where the judge regretted and wrote, he regretted to be able to have to found Kuberth guilty of unauthorized access. In the knowledge that the security researcher was funding members of OSWAP, so it was not anybody. And the judge had to say so because the judge especially said, it's not a motive to want to check if it's a scam. You committed unauthorized access. Misuse of tool is also a problem, especially in the UK, because there's no restriction. So even Tor and VPN will be an offense if you obtain unauthorized access or you're in that. And even supplying and offering to supply a tool can be a problem, as long as you have to believe that the criminals will use it. And we know full well that do you all use hacking tools? Well, the chances are good that criminals will use it. So you have to believe that criminal will use it. In international legal instruments for the misuse of tool, Article 7 of the directive has a cautious approach, so it's definitely trying to protect security researchers. Article 6 of the Convention on Cybercrime is the only one that actually protects expressly security researchers. Okay, and it was drafted because the security industry lobbied the Council of Europe quite effectively. Problem? Well, the first thing is national legislation never created the equivalent of Article 6.2. Only France did. There is no other protection offered for the other offences, so it only works for misuse of tool, doesn't work for unauthorized access. Could we use this clause to say, look, national legislation is to be interpreted in light of? Well, we can't extend national legislation by analogy, so that is really not possible. So I summarize here the problem for discovery, verification, and disclosure. Discovery is unauthorized access. Verification is probably misuse of tool being the proof of concept, and disclosure linked with encouraging an accessorial liability. So the solutions, what can we do about this? The first steps that some countries have already taken is to have prosecutorial guidelines and or memorandum of understanding. Good steps. I cannot deny that they are very useful. They set a number of boundaries and expectations. Netherlands did it, but some countries like Germany don't have prosecutorial discretion. So once something comes to knowledge, they cannot refuse to prosecute. More importantly, security researchers depend on goodwill and good understanding of the prosecution's authorities, which is not always the case. And once the prosecution has started, there is zero protection available. So the court will probably find them guilty because motive is not part of intent, and they will probably find that there is lack of authorization. So effectively, it's good to stop the flow of going to court, but it's not a foolproof, it's not a 100% guarantee. The restriction of the scope of offences, restricting the scope of offences, well, definitely for the UK, but for many countries it's not going to work, because otherwise too many cyber criminals will get away with it. So effectively, we're stuck with the fact we can't really change the offences. The UK a little bit, but many of national legislation won't be. Certainly not the convention and not the directive. And we have issues with, once in court, security researchers can't do anything. So that's where the public interest defense come in. And that's really, really key to think about it. Defense in criminal law means that you take into account motives. You're saying, yes, you've committed this offense. There is enough certainty to say that you committed this offense, but you've got good reasons to do so. I acknowledge that you are justified in doing so, and therefore I'm going to say that you're not guilty. We all heard about self-defense, necessity, self-defense. When we're attacked, we can attack back. Now, how is that incorporated? You've got the concept in legal terms of necessity. Motives are taken into account for necessity. I don't think that will be very difficult for legitimate security researchers to say that the access or the attempt to access was necessary for the purpose of finding the vulnerability and fixing it. Now, the key point is proportionality. Were the steps taken reasonable, proportionate to the aim? And it's not about the best techniques, it's about good practice, looking at ethical requirements, fitting within those ethical requirements, and the practice in the industry, and awareness of risk. So a public interest defense will not protect from prosecution so much than it will protect from the fact that a security researcher can argue that in court and can effectively avoid conviction. Now, is that a novelty? No. Defenses are very classic tools in criminal law. And in the UK, it already exists. Except it doesn't exist for security research in cybercrime. It exists for cybersecurity research in relation to data protection laws. There is a defense in the Data Protection Act in the UK, 2018. It has necessity, reasonable belief that the testing was justified for being in the public interest. The testing to find weakness in the software. And it has to be proportionate, including disclosure. So that notion of responsible disclosure is integrated into the legislation. So it's not impossible. And I argue that we could do the same, and we should do the same with cybercrime legislation. It's time to make cybercrime laws fit for the 21st century. The slogan is not mine. Disclaimer, it is the NCC group. If you go on their website, you'll see that. It's the main idea that it's 30 years on since the UK started its legislation, 20 since the convention, more recent for the directive. We need to think about cybersecurity researchers, and that will have also an impact on journalists and whistleblowers, because so far, when you leak data as a whistleblower, you're committing unauthorized access. Thank you for having listened to me. Thank you for Code Blue for this invitation of presenting. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this conference, and I will be answering questions. Thank you.